Coloradans about the death penalty, because most people don't know pretty much anything about how the death penalty actually works. So that's a lot of our work. But so I grew up in a super Republican home in western Nebraska, in Scottsbluff. My dad was a Marine, and my formative memories around the death penalty were my dad standing in the living room with a frying pan the last time Nebraska executed somebody. So, I mean, I was like 15 years old at that point, and my dad's, like holding a frying pan, really excited about it. And so I grew up all for the death penalty. I had no problem with the death penalty. And in fact, in high school then, I debated people to keep the death penalty. So I was all for it. I went on to school in Lincoln and was a political science major, because I've always been a political science nerd ever since I was a child. And while I was in school, a girl that I had mentored from my hometown, she was 15 years old, was kidnapped, raped, and murdered. And the guy came forward and confessed. They, of course, sought the death penalty and gave him the death penalty. And I was like, heck yeah, fry the bastard. And two things were happening around this time. One was I had become an evangelical Christian. So I had all these teachings that Jesus taught that kind of flew in the face of saying fry the bastard, that I had to sort of reconcile. But I also had a political science professor who said to me, well, he's never going to be executed. Nebraska doesn't kill people. It's fine. They just wasted a whole bunch of money, gave him the death penalty, and, gave him the death penalty, and they're never going to kill him. And I was already involved in politics, already jaded about politics, but I didn't have any idea what he was saying. I didn't know much about the criminal justice system at all at that point. So I did what any good political science student would do. I read 25 books on the death penalty that year, because I was trying to get to the bottom of why we weren't going to kill this guy. And let me tell you that reading could ruin your life, so be careful. But I never in a million years thought that reading these books would cause me to see just how messed up the system is and actually end up changing my mind on the death penalty. So I changed my mind mostly because of the risk of executing an innocent person. I didn't realize how easy it was to put an innocent person on death row, but then it's basically impossible to prove your innocence once you're there. So that was a big part of it. And I went to hear a speaker. She was an 80-year-old nun. If you've ever seen the movie Dead Man Walking, Susan Sarandon played Sister Helen Craven. So I went to hear her speak when I had already changed my mind, and I was really mad about these injustices. And this little 80-year-old nun grabs me by the arm and she says, "Sweetie, it's not enough to be mad about injustice. You got to do something about it." And so naturally, I went back and I joined the board of Nebraskans Against the Death Penalty, because that's what you do. And I was on the board for probably about 8 months when the old director left to go to grad school. And the board members were like, "Hey, you should apply." And I was like, "Oh, heck no." Like, are you kidding me? This is a tough task in Nebraska, But they eventually talked me into it. And the thing that sort of changed my mind on why I should try anyway to do it is that I do have this conservative background, and I'm evangelical, and so I could appeal to the average Nebraskan, and I'm a convert, so I knew where people were coming from. So I guess when I took the job, the average reaction was people laughing at me. They were like, "Yeah, right, Nebraska's never going to repeal, but that's cute, have fun with that." And I think probably the fighter in me took that as a challenge at that point, to figure out how can we actually get it done in Nebraska. And what I'll tell you is, even though Nebraskans tend to be very conservative and have just always voted Republican because that's just what their families do, they actually are fairly smart, reasonable people when you get down to it. I mean, farmers, ag people, they're pretty practical. And so when I figured out that I could break down the death penalty into practical terms that the average person could understand, I started to see Nebraskans change their mind over beers and whiskey. Like I would just sit there with people, and I always said if I could just spend 20 minutes with every Nebraskan, we'd get rid of the death penalty. That wasn't really practical, but that's what I knew. So really, how we did it when I started thinking about what our strategy was and what our plan was it was all about how we framed this issue. I stayed as far away from morality of the death penalty as I could, because I believe that you could debate the morality of the death penalty all day long and never get anywhere and just go in circles, right? Like, is it right, is it wrong? I don't know. But when I said the death penalty is a failed government policy, and here's why, then it was very practical. Then it was down into terms that people could understand. And at a certain point, you can't argue with the facts. Like you can try and hold on to your view, but the facts would bear out eventually, and it wasn't a morality question anymore that couldn't be resolved. So framing it as a failed government policy then led me to realize that there are certain core values that the average conservative in Nebraska held. And when I thought about it, like if you consider it a conservative litmus test, there are a couple things that the average conservative would say for a policy to be considered good, sound conservative policy. It needs to be fiscally responsible. It needs to be pro-life. It needs to be promote limited government, small government, let's not make it bigger. Government transparency, and promoting the government playing by the rules. And when I'd sit down with a conservative and I'd say, do you agree? Those are conservative values. And they'd be like, yeah. And then I'd say, the death penalty fails at every single one of those. And then they were intrigued, right? Like at that point, then I get to talk about...
Explain this magic.
Right. The fact is, the death penalty is not fiscally responsible. And people still fight with me on that to no end, but I will tell you that every state that has studied the cost of the death penalty has found that it's at least 3 times more expensive than keeping somebody in prison for the rest of their lives. At least. So some states found it's as much as 10 times more expensive. And there's a couple reasons for that. Death penalty cases are incredibly complicated, they're long, you have to pay a bunch of attorneys, a bunch of experts. So just the initial case or initial trial is enormously expensive. But then you add on top of that all of the appeals, and you're talking an enormous amount of money to try and kill somebody, when most of the time it'll get overturned at some point and they'll end up with a life sentence anyway. So then the pro-life issue, I only brought it up with certain folks in Nebraska. Not everybody cared about a policy being pro-life, but for a lot of folks who were championing being pro-life, I was talking to them about being pro-life across the board. And at what point, if you believe in the sanctity of life and that you believe that God gave life, do people lose the image of God? Are they no longer sacred beings? Just because they commit a crime, they've given up the image of God in them? So for a lot of folks, that was sort of an underlying concern as they're dealing with the policy. But then the limited government aspect. I mean, what's more government overreach than the power to kill its citizens? And for a lot of the Republicans, Stacy and I were just talking about this, but somebody actually said this on the floor during the debate. Republicans said, look, I don't trust the government with my health care. I don't trust them to fill potholes appropriately. Why on earth do I trust the government to kill its citizens and to do it right? So for a lot of conservatives, that was sort of their light bulb moment, when they didn't trust the government with so many other things, and they saw that the government was getting it wrong a lot. At this point, we're at a rate of one person exonerated from death row every month in this country. And that really, what it works out to is one person for every 9 people we execute is found innocent sitting on death row.
One a month?
One a month right now. So if you think about it, if one plane would crash for every 9 that took off, we would just ground the entire system, right? Like we wouldn't be flying anymore until we figured out what was going on. But that's the rate of error that we're finding with the death penalty right now. And that should be enormously concerning to anybody. And even if you don't believe that we should retain the lives of guilty people, if you're pro-life, you believe in defending the life of innocent people. The death penalty is threatening innocent people. And so if you're pro-life, you should be against the death penalty. So then the government transparency issue. This actually came up quite a bit in Nebraska as they were looking around the country and they were seeing all of these shady government secrets of where the drugs are coming from, who's giving them the drugs. And then right there in our own state, our governor was buying drugs from a guy in India who was making them in his own apartment, in his unair-conditioned apartment in Mumbai, India. And
Show people?
what's that?
The execution drugs?
The execution
We're not
drugs.
talking Molly. We're talking killing people.
What's that?
We're talking drugs to kill people?
Yes, the execution drugs. So, so we couldn't find them in the U.S., so we found a guy who's making them in his apartment in India, and the FDA was sort of like, I don't think that's legal. And the DEA said, no, they're not coming into the country. And they've now, I'm not joking, they've now sent the Nebraska governor, both the last governor and the current governor, 9 letters saying, knock it off, we're not letting you have your drugs. And they just keep giving this Indian middleman more and more money to get drugs, because he keeps saying, I figured it out, I know how to do it. And we keep paying him money up front. It's amazing. And that was actually one of the things that caused conservatives to just be like, look, I may not morally have a problem with the death penalty, but that's nonsense, and I don't want to be in that business anymore. So the other thing is the whole idea of the government playing by the rules, and with something as important as life or death, this shouldn't be political, right? Like, it should be fair, it should be just, there should be checks and balances on this. And one of the things that we discovered around the country, we've done several studies now, is that prosecutors in counties have unilateral discretion about whether to seek the death penalty. They don't have to ask anybody, there's no board, there's no checks or balances. If they want to seek the death penalty, they can. And so what we found is that prosecutors will seek the death penalty more right before an election.
Shocking. Shocking.
I know, clutch the pearls, it's political. But that's really upsetting, especially when you look at the statistics of what victims mattered to prosecutors. Almost always white, wealthy victims mattered, and poor victims of color didn't, in the respect of, where are we going to spend this enormous amount of resources? We're going to spend it prosecuting the person who killed a rich white person, because who's likely to show up and vote for a DA? The rich white folks. And they know this and they calculate it. And the studies are showing over and over again that judges who are elected are less likely to overturn cases that should be. Prosecutors that are elected seek the death penalty more close to elections. For a lot of conservatives who really do believe in fairness, that drove them crazy. And so we framed it this way for years in the public. We were doing this work in the media ahead of time before we even got to trying to push it in the legislature. We were creating this public narrative that it was a failed, broken policy, and that it was broken beyond repair. There was no way to fix it. We need to just get rid of it. So then, the other strategy that we employed is that we started talking to people before they got themselves on the record, which was absolutely critical. And I would say this is a lesson that I want to take into every advocacy work that I do from now on, is that if you can get to people before they say something on the record and ask them to consider, and even give them a talking point for how to answer the question on your issue that leaves them space to learn about it and change their mind, you're more likely to be able to get them to vote with you. And what happened with this issue is I went out and I met with every candidate for legislature before the primary. And which was a lot of travel around a giant state, but it worked because I could say to them, don't go on the record. Don't say to the newspaper, I support the death penalty. Don't put it on your website. Don't tell people that you are in favor of the death penalty. Even if you are, don't lock yourself in. Don't paint yourself into a corner. Instead, say something to the effect of, I believe death is an appropriate punishment, but I'll listen to the debate. It leaves them so much room to be able to do it. So it even sounds like they're pro-death penalty, but it left them room to consider the issue and to vote. We had one senator on the floor say that he promised his constituents he would support the death penalty. He had changed his mind, but felt like he couldn't vote for repeal because he had promised his constituents. So it turned out to be hugely important that we invested that time. The other thing that we did was a lot of grassroots support to try and prove to the senators that the death penalty is no longer the third rail of politics. Senators really believed that if they voted for repeal, they would get voted out of office. So we did polling to show them that wasn't true. But we also had just a huge groundswell of people saying, I'm going to vote you out of office if you don't support repeal. And actually, as it turns out, if you look at the polling, people who vote on the issue of the death penalty are doing it because they support repeal, and the candidate that they're voting for doesn't. Like, they'll vote those people out of office and not the other way around, which was kind of a huge revelation for people. Like, traditionally, the tough on crime, this is what's going to get you voted out, just isn't true anymore. And we were able to prove that to the senators to create that safety for them to vote for it. And finally, the central strategy outside in terms of creating the atmospherics to allow this to happen was we just kept taking storytellers to the media. So we had murder victims' family members that opposed the death penalty for many reasons, but mostly because the years and years of appeals causes them to just go through cycles and cycles of pain. And so we had them talking to the media, and we brought in death row exonerees, and we brought people who actually had to carry out the executions in other states who were suffering from PTSD, because really we're essentially asking a state employee to kill somebody on our behalf, and that's a heavy weight for them to try and carry. So we took storytellers to the media, and that created this huge narrative that basically the first time the vote came in and the opposition realized we had the votes, they were so far behind they couldn't possibly flip the narrative. They couldn't possibly win everybody back. Like, they tried really hard, and they used scare tactics, and they leaned on people. But by that point, everyone was so convinced that it was a failed policy that they couldn't come up with a way to convince them that we could still fix it, that we could keep the death penalty and be okay. Thank you. And so at that point, like, we knew we had won, basically. The other thing that happened, though, is we had to play a massive inside game within the legislature. So we got a champion, a conservative champion, who sort of rallied his conservative troops, and we had 16 Republicans vote for it, and we had 10 Republicans co-sponsors on the bill. So they did it together. They did it as a group. And so when all that pressure started coming in, and let me tell you, the governor vetoed the bill and sent it back to the legislature. The day that they passed the bill, a police officer in Omaha was shot and killed. And I remember seeing the news and being like, we just lost, okay. Because the governor had vetoed, sent it back, and we were just a few days away from having to take the vote to override the governor's veto. But what happened was those conservatives got together and said, the death penalty doesn't work. It obviously didn't deter that guy. We're probably never gonna execute him. Like, the last person who killed a cop in the state didn't get the death penalty. We know it costs so much money. They went back to all the things they knew of why the death penalty didn't work and why this horrific crime didn't make the death penalty work all of a sudden. And they held strong, amazingly, to their credit. They held strong. And so, in the end, we managed to get it done. Now, Nebraska is currently facing a referendum on the death penalty because the governor was so upset about losing that he put $200,000 of his own money into a referendum campaign, and his dad, who owns the Cubs, which is why I was cheering against the Cubs last week. His dad, who owns the Cubs, also put in $200,000 of his own money. So $400,000 of personal money from the governor and his dad were spent on a referendum. And so they had 300 full-time paid signature gatherers to get this on the ballot, which apparently you can buy a referendum as well. And so it's now going to be on the ballot in November of 2016. And so the campaign is almost identical, but just to the people of Nebraska now. So I'm no longer there. I'm here, obviously, doing the work here. But they got a lot of work ahead of them to get to the average Nebraskan. But I think if we can really get the word out that we can't get the drugs, it doesn't change any of the problems with the death penalty, even if you keep it on the books, Nebraskans will probably reject it the way the legislature did. So, with that, I'm happy to take questions and talk about the issue or what Nebraska did, anything. Boy,